Welcome back to another episode of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast, powered by ISOFIT, Oro Muscles, and Firefly Recovery. ISOFIT is my go-to for all things isometric strength training. For more on ISOFIT, be sure to check out isofit.com. Oro Muscles revolutionizes rehabilitation with real-time actionable insights into muscle activity with live biofeedback and instant analysis, which has made a huge impact in my work with athletes. For more on Oro, be sure to check out oromuscles.com. Episodes like this are made possible by Firefly, the official recovery provider of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast. For more on Firefly, be sure to check out recoveryfirefly.com. Joining me today is Dr. Quincy Johnson. Quincy and I are going to be diving into strength and conditioning considerations for the tactical athlete, drawing a lot of points made off of Quincy's own research down at Kansas. Quincy is an amazing individual. Really appreciate his time and insights, and I know you're going to love this episode. Enjoy. Quincy, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with you today. For people who might not be familiar with you and all the incredible work that you and your team are doing down there in Kansas, would you mind filling them in a little bit about who you are and all that you do?
Well, sure. Well, first, thanks, Dan, for having me on today. Really appreciate the opportunity. Yeah, I'm Dr. Quincy Johnson. I'm a assistant professor here at the University of Kansas in our Department of Health, Sport, Exercise Sciences. I always tell people I wear a lot of hats. So I guess the big hat that I wear is I'm responsible for teaching our undergrad, grad level strength conditioning, sports science courses. And then once I take that hat off, I put on a slightly smaller hat, and I'm assistant director here in our Jayhawk Athletic Performance Laboratory. So for those out there that have heard of the lab or have heard of sports science, we're doing really, really great things on the research front, but also the practical application front. So there are three of us here, Dr. Fry, Dr. Andrew Fry, who I look up to in high regard as one of the trailblazers in our field, not only for sports science, but also at the cellular level, molecular level, endocrine response. So he's very well versed in those aspects, and he leads the charge for us. And then we have Dr. Dimitri Chabarkaba, who specializes in elite athletic performance, profiling, and sports science approaches. So that's a slightly less large hat. And then I guess the next hat that I wear is, and we might talk about it briefly, but long-term athletic development. So we have a youth exercise and sports center here. But outside of that, our lab focuses on elite athletic performance. Doesn't have to just be traditional sports, right? So also tactical athletes. So that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, it's so interesting you bring up that term tactical athlete because I feel like for a lot of individuals getting into the space, and maybe I was guilty of this myself, right? You walk out of school with that degree in exercise science and you think you run the world, and then you realize, oh, wow, there's a lot I actually don't know. And that was definitely me with the tactical space that way, is I didn't really know about, how to modify what I'm doing or why I'm doing things for that tactical population, whether it be the firefighter, the military personnel. And there was a lot of different things that I found that this population has that are different and unique than your typical field sport athlete. And I find that I'm not the only one that feels that way. So, what kind of things should coaches, clinicians kind of consider themselves with as it comes to the tactical athlete that way? You mentioned the term profiling as well. Is there a way to kind of profile the tactical athlete into like subtypes that way? Do you break it up by like military personnel, law enforcement, firefighter, or do you have a different kind of way that you kind of think about the whole term tactical athlete that way?
That's a great question, and I think my answer might change every time that I'm asked that, because the more experience you get, it's like, wow, okay, now I have another perspective on how to approach not even program design, but maybe just the conversations that we have based off of this many weeks or months of experience with this population of tactical athletes. Um, so I guess one of my foundational components for approaching general, specific strength and conditioning are just like my three or four key elements. So number one is being able to provide value. Do I have enough interest or do I know the subject matter enough or do I have the certifications and the education to provide value to these folks, Um, their role, their jobs, their careers are very, very important. And we all know time is important as well. So, can I provide value? And am I taking the time and am I prioritizing building relationships, maintaining relationships? Probably later I'll tell you about my first, I guess, role within tactical S&C and how important it is to build and maintain relationships, as with other things. And then identifying problem areas or questions that we can help, answer and then like providing a solution. So once you've done that, then I think it kind of opens up a little bit on how we can categorize the types of tactical athletes. For me, and for us in the past, we have firefighters might have a slightly different strength conditioning program based on their shift hours and their shift duration and their sleep and how they recover versus law enforcement officers versus ROTC cadets. So it does look a little bit different, but generally the main components, load, reps, sets, rest in between sets, we can manipulate that to number one, just keep them training, and then number two, to improve physical characteristics.
Yeah, and
I don't
on
know if
that
that
point,
answered your question or if I
yeah,
kind
definitely.
of
Definitely. On that point, too, you mentioned load, sets, reps, rest. I think the other big variable to that is access to equipment because some of these different facilities have so much and some of them have very little, if any. And it's like, well, we're going to master calisthenics and body weight and just general GPP and do what we can there. But I think the other key variable I see a lot in this space is what do they have access to and how can I make the most of that? And I think that's the other piece too is just the overall size of whatever group you're working with. Obviously, if you can get a tactical athlete one on one, it's great. But I found that's very rarely the case. Usually it's groups of them. So if you're talking a large group, even if you do have equipment, it's a matter of how can I effectively and efficiently cycle this group of individuals through this limited equipment and limited space that we have that way.
right, right. Um, and yeah, that's kind of before you even for my recommendations for those out there hoping to work with tactical athletes or continuing through a program is aside from those four foundational points, definitely just do an analysis of what type of resources do we have? What do we have access to? What are our limitations? And how can we get creative should we need to in certain areas as far as like exercise selection, implementation, program design, periodization, things like that. Yeah.
It sounds like this is really an athlete population, and not to say that the others are not as well, but it sounds like you really have to have a robust framework built out to work with this population and succeed that way. You have to have a system of this is what I'm going to do, this is how I'm going to approach it. And on top of that as well, you need to be able to like be well versed in a variety of different training styles based on what we just mentioned on the potential limited access to equipment, right? If you've got large groups or you have limited access to equipment, then you knowing bodybuilding and CrossFit style training may not be the best thing in the world for you. Maybe you need to have other well-versed experiences that way. Maybe, I don't know, animal flow. I'm just picking that out of thin air at this point, but just some kind of other approaches to training that might be a little bit different than the like historical or traditional approach, I would say.
Yeah, yeah. My background originally, well, I'm a former athlete, so I played football through college. I started training with a certified strength conditioning specialist when I was 12 years old. And in that gym, there were high school athletes, college athletes. So my background is athletic performance and then powerlifting. So I've won a couple national titles powerlifting. I've started a scholarship-based program at Midland University. So that's my second strong front, and then the next one, um, functional movement screening, foundational movement patterns. So I'll agree with you. You definitely have to have a couple different tools in that exercise selection toolkit that you're comfortable with, and also just being able to be, flexible, adaptable. So, um, adhering to a set schedule and a set duration for training, just in a tactical space. There are just so many different variables that are uncontrollable. We know we were expecting the unexpected, so yeah, just being able to be fluid, flexible, adaptable.
Yeah, I like you mentioned that term, expect the unexpected, a couple of times there. And earlier you also mentioned about the importance of forming relationships as it comes to working in the tactical athlete space. And I think that is probably one of the most like game-changing things I've done over the past couple of years for my own clinical practice is I want to connect with anyone and everyone I can that works with the athlete that I'm working with. I don't care if it's AT, strength coach, other PT, I don't care what the title is, but I want to know that person. I want to have a conversation about how we can best all work on the same team for that athlete that's in front of us. And I found when it relates to the tactical athlete population, it can sometimes be a little bit more difficult to form those kind of partnerships initially that way, just depending on the setting that you have, right? I found it's a little easier for law enforcement and firefighter, but I've had a more difficult time connecting with individuals within the Department of Defense, obviously for good reason. But I found that the more you can make those connections, the easier this process is because, you might want to program a certain thing for them, and someone else might tell you, hey, look, they had, this thing 5 years ago, and they haven't done it since then. So being able to like get a look into some of those like past history things and other things that might not come up in your initial conversations with the athlete themselves, but do tend to come up with other providers, I think can really change the game as far as how you approach programming for the tactical athlete.
And just being able to, well, also just having conversations, being able to communicate effectively and identify goals. I've found, just being able to clearly identify and establish goals that are realistic, they're attainable, the SMART goals. They're specific, measurable, they're attainable, they're realistic, and they're time sensitive. So, um, just being able to do those things so that way everybody's in alignment, and so that way, there's less delay in the amount of progress that you can make, I guess is the point that I'm making there. But yeah, you're spot on. Just being able to identify and have those conversations.
When you mentioned the SMART goals in relation to the tactical athlete population, and obviously in relation to your programming that way, just general 30,000 foot overview, what does your programming typically look like? Is this like, we're programming out for a whole year, or we're going monthly blocks that way? And then how do the goals fit into that? Are you doing goals every month or goals for the end of the year? How do you kind of approach that programming and goal setting for the tactical athlete?
Yeah, I think a lot of strength conditioning professionals, they draw on prior experiences. So my approach, just zooming all the way out, is I just plan it out like a year, just like your typical calendar year. What things are on that typical calendar year that might affect or influence training, holidays. So we account for holidays, not that they're going to be off, but that it might be a heavy stress period like July 4th for a first responder, a firefighter, law enforcement officer. It might be high volume, high call days. So I zoom out after we've set the goals for the year or for a couple years. Then I set up the calendar based off of holidays, based off of typical days that they'd like to come in and train, and then how many hours do we have between training sessions, and then we start to take a very general approach. So just developing muscular endurance, giving them a solid basis of training, ready to train, readiness to train, and then developing kind of in a progressive manner, hypertrophy, strength, power, and we just keep a very, very balanced rotation of each of those components within. So, do I program heavy strength blocks, heavy power blocks? Not necessarily, because I think they always need to be at their peak, but they always need to have a very solid base of general physical preparedness. So, um, that's how I program.
Yeah, it's so interesting. You brought up the endurance as kind of that overwhelming like foundation for everything else. And I've heard that from a number of other individuals in the past as well in relation to the tactical athlete is it comes back to work capacity. It comes back to physical preparedness. It comes back to VO2, right? I think there's a stat or study out there in relation to firefighters that when they're wearing the oxygen tank, their VO2 drops significantly just from having the mask on. But then in addition to that, you've got an additional 50, 60, 70 pounds of gear slowing you down. So if you're not robust and well versed in that to start, you're operating at a disadvantage, I'll say. And I think that that conversation around endurance and GPP is so interesting because obviously it's real easy to just throw a ton of volume at someone and get their heart rate up, right? If you want hard training, go do 100 burpees as fast as you can. but there's also a quality element that comes into this. And earlier you mentioned you did some work on FMS and just overall movement analysis and that sort of thing. And I guess that's really a unique spot to look at the tactical athlete through is how do we balance quality of movement with quantity of movement? Because we know we need to get a lot of movement. We know we need to spike heart rate and make the training hard, but at the same time, at what point do we sacrifice the quality for that? Or do we never sacrifice quality in order to get that general like physical prep and endurance work in?
Yeah, from my vantage point, and my philosophy, never sacrifice quality. Um, the intensity can wait, the high volumes can wait, until we have optimal exercise technique. I don't think it's worth adding any of those additional elements, mainly because it just puts that individual in a less optimal position to perform, right, that exercise, and then it might expose them to an increased risk of injury. Um, we had a recent study published looking at an abbreviated model for the functional movement screen. So we have some pretty unique findings there in that space. So for those who aren't familiar, the functional movement screen, and it's abbreviated FMS. There are 7 movements in that screen. So you have a deep squat, you have a hurdle step, you have an inline lunge, you have shoulder mobility, you have active straight leg raise, you have a trunk stability push up, and then you have rotary stability. So we had almost 100 participants. We had 99 law enforcement officers and firefighters participate. And what we found is deep squat, inline lunge, shoulder mobility, and push-up ability. It accounts for 84% of the functional movement total score. So if you're short on time or you just want to be a little bit more efficient in the screening process, we know those 4 movements, they account for more than most of the total score. So
Yeah. So, how did you come to the conclusion that those four movements were the big four out of the seven that way to focus on that way? And why do you think that the lunge, the squat, the trunk stability push up, and the shoulder that way, why do you think those were kind of like the four that related the best for this population?
sure, those are both great questions. So we ran a type of analysis. It's a modeling analysis called a linear regression model. So for each variable that you put in to predict one outcome variable, it gives you a percent contribution. So that helps us. It's evidence based. So it's not just looking and saying, well, I guess their shoulder mobility, they did well on that. It looks good. Let's focus on shoulder mobility. No, this is evidence-based approach. And tying back into if you're working on number one, just a general approach to program design, and you're looking for a place to start, evaluating from my perspective, past medical history, the ability to move well, so mobility, flexibility, stability, strength, power, those things as well. This is a great way to help improve or enhance your program, select exercises that may benefit the first responder. So, squat is a foundational movement pattern that is well published. There are plenty of books out there, research manuscripts that say your ability to squat influences your ability to jump and to run and to just quality of life in general. The same thing with inline lunge or the ability to be in a split stance, the ability to stabilize yourself throughout different movement patterns. The shoulder mobility as well, right? So the ability to move your shoulders, internal, external rotation, and then push up ability as well. So these are foundational movement patterns, and I would say they can be progressed as well. So you could have your base exercises in there, you can progress them, you can regress them as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think there's something to be said about just mastering those foundational movement patterns. And I think the basis for those three or four movements that you mentioned really show up in almost every strength program I've ever seen, right? Pretty much everyone is doing some kind of squat variation, some kind of lunge variation, some type of pressing variation. Maybe it's not the push up, maybe it's a dumbbell bench, or maybe it's, a bench press variation that way. It's always some kind of combination of those things in almost every program that I see. And obviously, I think the shoulder mobility piece is key as well that way, because depending on the age group you're looking at that way, that can really change what you're looking at from a tactical athlete population here is, I think when you're thinking about like a field sport athlete, a lot of times I think high school, college, and even in the pros, usually 20s or 30s. With tactical athlete, we could be talking 30s, 40s, 50s, sometimes
Mhm.
even older. So I think that the age contribution shows up here as well, and making sure that a lot of these things are maintained for the, longevity of career that way are also really important, right? Like, if we can't get good shoulder mobility in our 50s, what are we going to look like when we're in our 60s and still trying to do the same task?
Right. That's exactly right. So you make a good point there that in most programs there's a good element of squats and push-ups and lunging. So across the lifespan, really, these exercises, from what we've seen and what we can say based on the evidence we're seeing for the tactical athlete, these are the exercises that you'd want to assess and you want to at least maintain the ability to perform.
Yeah, no, definitely. And this is the minimum. So I guess that's the other piece too, is I know like I'm somewhat familiar with the functional movement system that way. And I know that after FMS, a lot of people also run the SFMA, or I see the SFMA popping up a lot more in medical settings lately that way. Is there any future plans to expand on initial research that way with like a SFMA model, or kind of dive in deeper on the overall concept of movement assessment and screening for the tactical population, or?
Yeah, and I guess it just depends on who the practitioners are. And again, it comes back to the resources and what they have access to. Something that I've become interested in is markerless 3D motion capture. So Dari has a phenomenal system that they've created. Um, and I'd love to screen firefighters, law enforcement officers, cadets, maybe just a wide variety of tactical athletes at many different levels across the lifespan, just to take it one step further and to really see joint kinetics and kinematics. So I think it really depends on who's doing it, what resources we have. So that's kind of in the future, my next step. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I like that. I like that a lot. And on that concept of 3D analysis too, I think there's something to be said about being able to look at everything, kind of like you mentioned at the joint level, but also even just a little bit deeper from a like physiological standpoint or overall just body composition standpoint. And it's funny because I've seen body composition analysis making a big increase or comeback, I would say, in the college realm. A lot of colleges that I, get some time to visit have bod pods or DEXA scans or something like that that they're doing on athletes regularly. And I guess I'm curious, is that something that's also done in the tactical athlete? And, what is kind of that quote unquote optimal balance, if you will, for the tactical athlete, right? Like I think a lot of individuals have come to recognize that, leaner is not always better for the field sport athlete. A running back at 5% body fat might not be better than 10% body fat, for example. So what does that kind of like body comp contribution look like for the tactical athlete that way?
Yeah. Generally, it might be unique to the population, but it might definitely be unique to department. It just really depends based on the physical fitness standards and kind of like what you mentioned earlier, age, experience, a few other factors. Something unique that we found in the past looking at ROTC cadets. We looked at upperclassmen who had been in the program, a physical fitness program for over 3 years, 3 or 4 years, typically junior seniors. And then we looked at underclassmen who were either first year in the program, second year in the program. We had some interesting evidence-based observations. Body mass index was similar, right? So kilograms divided by meter squared, right? Kilogram per meter squared. So your weight relative to your height. That was similar. There was no significant difference. However, whenever we take it a step further and we looked at fat mass and muscle mass for upperclassmen, their fat mass was lower and their muscle mass was higher, which shows it provides evidence. Like if you are adhering to a strength and conditioning program that is well balanced, it includes foundational exercises, it develops a pretty significant base of general physical fitness, and you can translate that to what you need. There are differences and there are benefits in that aspect. From what I've seen, from what we've published for firefighter versus law enforcement, they're pretty similar as far as height and weight goes, but again, it depends on department by department and fitness standards and age and those factors.
Yeah, so it sounds like in general, regular training improves composition, which I think makes a lot of sense. And obviously, I think that's a pretty easy KPI that way. Even if you're in a tactical setting and you're tight on budget, I'm pretty sure the calipers are like $10 on Amazon. And it's not the best thing in the world, but it gets the job done compared to nothing that way. I'd love it if everyone had like a, 3 grand toe back or something like that. But, again, the calipers will get the job done at the end of the day. And I think the other piece too is I guess I'm always kind of interested. What does the KPI carry over to performance that way, right? Like, obviously we expect that someone will get better at their, tactical, role that way as an operator in 3 or 4 years' time. How much of that is due to the physical training element of them getting stronger, faster, better composition that way, as opposed to just them getting used to like the other elements of the job that way or the other elements of their operation that way. And I think, at least for me, and this is just theoretically that way, improving body composition, I think just improves everything, not just from the physical performance, but just the overall health of the athlete. So going back to what we talked about longevity that way, I think the more muscle someone has at a young age, the better off they're going to be when they're doing the same thing in their 30s, in their 40s, in their 50s, and so on. That way, I think everyone who's studied exercise science has gone through some kind of physiology class and has to learn about how the body ages. And if you're like me, you kind of take that stuff and let it go in one ear and out the other because, well, I just want to work with athletes. I don't need to worry about this. And then you get into the space and you realize like, oh shoot, like athletes age, I'm aging. I actually have to go back and brush up on that. And in this space, I feel like if you can get them to that higher composition of muscle mass earlier on, everything functions better, right? You've got less of a concern about systemic inflammation. You've got less of a concern about, health conditions relating to being overweight and so on that way. And then you can keep them there and can continue to keep them there long term as they progress throughout their career and kind of give them the best of both from a performance and a longevity in sport that way.
And just improving body composition, you're improving the amount of contractile tissue that an individual has. So we've seen for decades publications in the athletic space, right? For college athletes, for professional athletes, what contributes the most to force outputs and power outputs and speed, several different things. Obviously, it helps to have really great genetics, but also, like you mentioned, optimizing body composition, improving the amount of skeletal tissue or contractive tissue that you have in your body, improves the amount of force, during athletic movements or even general movements. So I'm excited for the next step in tactical athlete research to really examine and connect those dots. For so much of an increase in muscle mass, how much more strength do we get? And from how much more strength do we get, how does that translate to power? And then, like what you said, overall, just general health. That's one of my top two goal in my programs. Number one, my first goal is attendance. We can't we can't have a positive impact if we can't get them there. And then number two, we want to improve general health.
Yeah, so you mentioned the tendons. I think that soft tissue injury rate has obviously been alarming for a number of sports that way. The other thing, and maybe this is just my own clinical practice, but I've seen some different bony considerations lately that I don't remember seeing as much when I first started practicing that way. Overuse type things, stress reaction, stress fracture, all these different things that way. And I'm kind of having a lot more conversations with individuals lately about bone mineral density. I can't remember. Did you do any studies looking at bone mineral density in the tactical athlete population, or how much of a contribution do you feel that bone mineral density element is to that overall composition piece that way?
Yeah, that's a trending topic, I think, in the tactical athlete research space. I haven't conducted research in that space, but I know that Bond University They have a large tactical athlete population out there. They have access to some of the best um, tactical athlete researchers in this space and some great resources just in general. So I wouldn't be surprised if either Bond University or Cal State Fullerton or Oklahoma State University, if they begin to share some information on bone mineral density. I think it does play a role. I think it is influenced obviously by um, lifestyle factors, but also by resistance training and physical fitness, those things.
Yeah, definitely. It's just one of those, again, pieces to the puzzle. And again, you brought up tendons, which I think soft tissue injuries are the other big element to this as well. That way is I think we've seen soft tissue injuries on the rise for, a number of years in a variety of settings that way. And I think that there's certainly an age element to that as well. I distinctly remember one of those like random stats, you burning your head when you're in school about how after age 40, the male rotator cuff tendons tend to lose vascularity. And it's like, well, you mentioned shoulder health before. Having a good functioning, strong rotator cuff is really, really important for the tactical athlete that way. And obviously, all of these things impact their readiness to perform when they're called that way. If there's anything that's causing them pain or putting them at risk, unfortunately, in this space, it could create a liability for themselves and others. So, making sure we kind of check all of our boxes from a programming standpoint to make sure those are not an issue. I think as it relates to soft tissue and kind of injuries from a programming standpoint, the whole like phrase about an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure really carries weight in this population just due to the kind of work that they're called to do on the day to day.
Right. That's a great point. I agree with you there.
You also brought up earlier that you've been doing some force plate research lately and kind of diving into that sports science realm a bit more that way. And you mentioned that some of your colleagues do work on athlete profiling and that sort of thing that way. Has there been any kind of assessment on force plates in the tactical populations? And what's kind of the application of that? Is that to kind of help guide programming considerations? Is it more about that injury risk mitigation side or, return from injury that way? Is it more of an assessment of operational readiness? Because I found a lot of people are using the quote unquote sports science stuff now, but everyone kind of applies it a little bit differently for different reasons that way. So what's kind of been your take on the force plate analysis for the tactical operator that way?
Well, yeah, that's kind of one of the benefits to our technological advancements is now we have better technology that we can implement more broadly, right? They're more accessible, they're easier to use. It's easier to collect the data, interpret that data, and then communicate those findings. So exactly what you're saying, it's being used in a multitude of ways. There are a couple manuscripts that have been published by Merrigan and Kramer, and they've used tactical athletes within those studies to validate force plates, but to also just look at the differences in jump performance and metrics. So there are a few different ways that we're seeing it used, whether it's just as a standard baseline testing or continual testing and assessment or athlete monitoring. I haven't seen a ton on profiling the tactical athlete. We've published a couple papers on stronger versus weaker firefighters, but I'd be interested to see, force plate technology implemented that way. Do you have your high performers versus low performers, and what do their force time characteristics look like on a force plate? But at its base, I think that the utility of it could be to monitor readiness, to perform neuromuscular fatigue, things of that nature.
Yeah, and as you were talking about readiness and neuromuscular fatigue, at least for me, my mind instantly goes to the counter movement jump. That's probably like the most common thing I'm doing on plates myself that way. It's quick, it's easy, the athletes get it. But I find a lot of benefit as well, kind of diving in deeper and pairing that with other things. So I'll do squat jumps pretty regularly as well. And it's always so interesting to me to see how athletes utilize that eccentric component that way, or how effectively they use the stretch shortening cycle, because I found some are really, really good and some have no idea what they're doing there. And I'd imagine the same could be true for the tactical athlete population is, anytime I bring up force plates, I think everyone thinks of, the 7-page metric report and the hundreds of different tests you can perform on it now.
Right.
But I think the biggest thing is just have some kind of simple framework for what you're doing and why you're doing it in this space. And I think counter movement jump makes a lot of sense to me. Has there been any other kind of force plate assessments that you personally like in this tactical population that way?
Yeah, for most of the populations I work with, like many other, performance professionals, we love a good counter movement jump. We love a good squat jump or depth jump or whichever, any type of jump, we love it, because that is the expression of lower body muscular power in an athletic sense. But the foundational element of power to me is ability to produce maximum force. And then from there, can you produce force relative to time? So with my work through my Ph.D. with Dr. J. Dawes, I began to learn about the isometric mid-thigh pull and how critical it is and how easy it is to implement in a field-based setting with tactical athletes. So for me, that's like my 1-2 combo is an isometric mid-thigh pull. If you don't have access to an isometric mid-thigh pull rig and force plates, there are several other things you can utilize. There are chest back dynamometers, which are simple and they fold up. You could even do grip strength, but we need some type of strength assessment and then to look at, okay, you're strong, but do you translate that strength well? Or are you more of a force producer or are you a power producer? Is that your superpower? So I think if I had one recommendation to add in as far as force plate testing, it would be an isometric mid-thigh pull too.
I love that test as well. And it's so funny you bring that up because even just from an accessibility, portability standpoint, I'm spoiled to have an army of 4 different ISO fit devices to use that way. But I'll take my force plates and I'll take the ISO fit and I'll set it up somewhere and I'll just do thigh pulls with that. And I'm able to test, counter movement jump and thigh pull pretty much wherever we are that way. And I don't know about you, but I've really liked going back to that profiling piece for a second. I really like looking at dynamic strength index. Now, given I'm in a rehab setting, so it might be a little bit different than the performance setting for this, but I just want to get an understanding of, context of the athlete that I'm working with and how are they doing, as you mentioned before, the jump versus like an isometric, like max effort force pull that way. Athletes generally underexpress force in one of the two, which makes a lot of sense, but it varies a lot more than I thought based on the athletic population. So, for example, I had a football individual, a lineman, who came in and their DSI was a 1.0. And I'm like, either you're the world's best jumper as a lineman or you got to get stronger.
You're not very strong, yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
one of the two that way.
yeah.
But I think that having that quick and easy, like, hey, I do this counter movement jump, it takes 10 seconds. We do an
Mhm.
ISO thigh pull, which also takes like 5 to 10 seconds max. And then we can get like a real quick, easy number that gives me an understanding of how that athlete is expressing force is really easy. I think the other thing that's been real interesting for me with the thigh pull is it gives you a real quick max effort asymmetry left versus right. Obviously, it'll show up in the counter movement jump as well, but this is in a case where they're not even moving. So,
Right.
it's one thing to have asymmetries with movement. I think pretty much everyone I've ever tested on plates, regardless of if they've been injured, has some kind of slight asymmetry within the counter movement jump. But I don't always see asymmetries with force production in a thigh pull. I've also been really interested in time to peak force as it relates to the thigh pull as well. And maybe that's just getting a little too into the weeds, but I think there's something to be said, not just about producing a lot of force, but producing it quickly. And I think in the tactical setting, these operators are called to do things at, at the speed of like seconds, I would say. And being able to save a second could mean the difference between, for lack of a better way to put it, like life or death or success or failure of the mission, depending on the situation, depending on if we're talking military, Leo, or firefighter that way. So I think that having the ability to produce force, express force quickly, but also consider the, programming implications of the test really make the thigh pull a great application point as well.
Yeah, yeah, I think and then just regularly finding a way to implement, those forms of testing if you have access to a force plate especially, whether it's just weekly testing, first day of the week or last day of the week, however it's implemented, that force element and the power out element together helps paint, that bigger picture for you.
Yeah, say you don't have the force plates, but you still want to incorporate some kind of general sports science thing in the tactical population. If you're bowling on a budget and all you've got is the free Google Sheets and you're working with limited space and equipment that way, how could you still kind of create some kind of KPI performance testing battery in this space without something like the force plates and that sort of thing?
Well, sure, you could do subjective monitoring, it's valid, it's reliable, you don't even have to jump, So sometimes that becomes an issue as well. Just based on the demands of the occupation or age, it's like, well, we can jump, but are we getting the best quality information about this individual? Sometimes that subjective information, it could be as simple as sleep quantity, sleep quality. You can ask questions about hydration or nutrition status. You can ask questions about energy, mood. It doesn't have to be very long, and you create a Likert scale. 0 is absolutely terrible. 5 is absolutely fantastic. And these scales are valid, they're reliable. There's research out there as well. It could be as simple as that. If you only have access to a Google Sheet. I've implemented it before, athletic populations, tactical populations across the lifespan. So
Yeah, I love that concept. And I think it opens up a whole new world in the tactical athlete space as well, because that information is very easy to track. It's easy to get that every day. But it also kind of shows you the fluctuations in subjective readiness that way. Maybe you're working with a firefighter who is just on a 24-hour call day, which is not uncommon depending on where they're located. They're going to feel probably pretty exhausted the next day. And then they're going to see recovery, or maybe they don't, and then it's a time to intervene, right? So I think that having that kind of data can really get you a deeper understanding of what they're experiencing and how to best intervene, because, you know, it's weird to say this coming from such a strong exercise background, but I think sometimes more exercise is not always the answer, depending on how they're presenting to you. If they're coming in and they're in the red on every metric, to use your scales, for example, if they're a 1 out of 5 or a 1 out of 10 in sleep and self-reported readiness and so on that way, me deciding, what, today's going to be the day we do a super long session and run them into the ground probably won't be the best idea for them. Now, I'm not going to say that you avoid hard training entirely because they need to train hard, but I do think there's a certain element of risk reward as it comes to training and keeping the goal of readiness the main thing for this population that way.
exactly, especially for their career, right? Their occupational task and responsibility. Um, just making sure that they're in the most optimal state to be prepared to perform their jobs, to save lives, and to get home safely to their families.
Yeah, 100%. Quincy, I know you've got extensive experience researching this population and in the exercise science field in general. Is there anything that you have seen not work well or not go well in the tactical athlete population, or any kind of trends or fads that you've seen that have kind of shifted to the wayside for good reason in this population?
That's a great question. Is there a one size fits all model? I don't think so. And also, is there, this one secret ingredient? If you do this, you're going to hit it out the park every time. I don't think so, but I think that there are a few things that I have seen work well. I think there's always going to be um, popular trends in fitness, strength and conditioning, recovery, rehab, corrective exercise, all these things. But I think that number one, just having some type of training philosophy that resonates with the individual running that program. That's like very, very important. And then number two, um, before we get into the sets and the reps, like, can you provide that value? Can you? So the people that do well at that, I feel like from my experience, and whenever I focused on those things first, versus like, okay, we need to get them everybody to this time or this number of repetitions or this much force or this jump height. Having those things as a foundation really is the bridge to doing great things. But outside of that, just a general understanding of strength conditioning, program design, periodization, and then understanding the demands of the work of the job. So there are many different things work. There are many roads that lead to Rome, I think is the saying. So there are different ways to accomplish your goals. How you get there is based on your philosophy and how well you can connect with the population.
Yeah, and I find more and more that the biggest thing that matters is just being consistent in that approach, right? Like it doesn't necessarily matter if you prefer to go 5-3-1 or if you prefer to go all west side or whatever approach you decide to choose in this population that way. I think as long as you pick something and do it consistently, there's going to be improvement. I think a lot of people like to, argue over what I would call sand in the jar compared to rocks in the jar that way as far as like, well, in your program, this should be 8 reps instead of 10, or this should be 12 instead of 10. But I think in general, just consistent physical training done at a high level will carry you to the success that you need a lot more than, just trying to like master everything. I think that just in general, getting consistent training is generally the most important thing in this population.
Yeah, yeah. Attendance, consistency, general health, and then everything from there is a bonus win.
Yeah, I completely agree. Quincy, for people who want to find out more about the work that you're doing that way and keep up to date with your research contributions and so on, where can they find you at?
That is a great question. On Instagram at Quincy Johnson, Ph.D. That's where you can find me on Instagram. So I usually post something related to the research we're doing in our lab or upcoming research or spotlighting some of our awesome students or colleagues, friends of the lab. Also on X, the same handle at Quincy Johnson, PhD. So you can find me either of those two places. If they're really like into research, then I share a little bit more on ResearchGate, and you could just find me there, Quincy Johnson. So those are the places that you can find me. We can connect if there are any questions or any ways that maybe I can assist individuals out there.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. We'll link to that in the description below. Is there anything that we missed as we were talking today, or any other like points or considerations you wanted to really drive home?
We covered a fair amount of it. Maybe just really emphasizing focus on and master the basics, whether it's strength conditioning, whether it's corrective exercise or functional movement screen. From there, I know that with technology, we have more and more access to the data, but I always think about the what, the how, the why. So what exactly do we want to measure or monitor or track or change? How are we going to measure, monitor, track, change that? Why is it important? And then making sure that the information we communicate is in alignment with that. So, other than that, I think that's all I really had.
That's awesome. That's awesome, Quincy. It was a pleasure chatting with you again, and I cannot wait to see all of the amazing work that you and your team at Kansas are going to be putting out over the next year. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you.